How not to ask why questions. One thing we say about study of Torah is that if you can ask a question and you get a simple answer, it's wrong. Nothing's really simple. Nothing is really simple. That's certainly true about Torah in general. It may not be true about everything else, but a lot of things in life which we take for granted, if you push them, you look at them from different angles, you can often see that they're not as simple as that they seemed. Is it good to ask questions? For sure. We have a statement in a Baishan Lomed, someone who's embarrassed to ask questions will not learn. But there are right ways and wrong ways to ask questions. There are times when, in order to justify asking the question, you have to give some reason for asking the question. If you don't have a good reason for asking the question may have no place, may have no purpose. So, for example, the battle cry of the sophomore philosophy student, in any discussion is, define your terms, implying that if you can't define your terms, you don't know what you're talking about. If you don't know what you're talking about, the discussion's not going to go anywhere. Well, let's suppose you're discussing whether something is just or unjust. You're going to have trouble with that one, because philosophers have been working on that for about 2,500 years, and there's no agreement whatsoever on how justice should be defined. Or truth. So, is it really correct that we shouldn't have any discussions about justice or about truth because we can't define those concepts? Is that really true? Let's ask this tricky question. If you can't use a concept without a definition, if you don't understand what it means, if a discussion using that concept is somehow invalid or incompetent, how would you go about searching for a definition? Wouldn't the search for a definition be someone propose a definition, we'll discuss it for a while, and decide whether it's a good or bad definition? And if it's bad, discard it and go on to another one? Aren't you discussing the concept when you're looking for a definition? So if you couldn't discuss the concept without a definition, you couldn't look for a definition. That doesn't sound right. So the challenge to find your terms needs a justification. Why are you asking? Usually the answer is most terms, maybe all, have clear applications, and then they're unclear. There's a black area where they don't apply, a white area where they do apply, and a gray area where it's hard to tell. Now, if you're conducting a discussion and you're very careful to stay in the black and white areas where you know what the term means, you understand how it operates, you know what the conclusions are, and someone says, define your terms, the correct response is, why should I do that? Why do I need to? I only use the term in a way that we all understand it. Why are you looking for a definition? If I slip into the gray area where it's controversial or just undetermined, we just don't know what to say, then someone could say, look, you're using the term in the gray area. It's chancy. It may not turn out to mean what you think it means. Let's give it a definition. I hear that. But if you stay within the black and white areas, then the demand to define your terms is not correct. What I'm saying now is nothing of mine. And to ask any competent philosopher, he'll tell you the same story. So questions are not free. Now, a why question asks for an explanation. There are many different things that we question, there are different kinds of explanation, but the general content of a why question is want an explanation for something. The temptation is this: why A? Why is it that A? Oh, because B, that's why. And of course the follow-up will be, well then, I hear you, but why B? Mm-hmm. And when I tell you the answer is C, the follow-up will be, why C? Now, how far does this go? How does this game play out? If you have a principle I don't stop. I don't take anything for granted. I'm not satisfied just to hear a statement. I want an explanation. So you're committed to re-asking the why question every time. And you're not satisfied if you don't get an answer. If that's the way in which you ask why questions, then you've committed yourself to one of two ends. Either the questions go on forever, because you keep asking another one, or they don't go on forever, but they go around in a circle. Why is A because B? Why is C because why is B? Why is A because B? Why is B because C? Why is C because A? Why is A? I told you already. B, remember? Neither of those seems like a happy outcome. If there's no end to it, it means you never get your answer. And you go around in a circle, it sounds like you don't get any answer at all. Circle's just hanging in the air. A is because of B, B is because of C, and C is because of A, and then you go around, but you never get the answer for where the circle comes from. So, if you want to ask why questions, you have to be committed at the outset that there's such a thing as a stopping place. You mustn't have determined, I always re-ask the question no matter what answer I get. No. There has to be something, it's called a stopping place, which is acceptable without going further. If you don't allow that, then you've put yourself in a position where, by your own assumptions, you can't get an answer. Now, that doesn't mean all proposed stopping places are equal. A person could question whether a certain stopping place is an appropriate stopping place or isn't an appropriate stopping place. But to be against stopping places in principle just means that you're putting yourself in a position where the game has no end. Let me give you an example in terms of the kind of question that I'm interested in tonight. But let me start with a human situation. A person has a job, and you ask him, why are you working at that job? And he says, to earn money. And why do you want to earn money? Because I want to buy a house. And why do you want to buy a house? Because, right? Why do you want to buy a house? Because I want to live in the house. And why do you want to live in the house? Because I will enjoy living in the house. And why do you want to do what you will enjoy? That's a stupid question. Are you nuts? Why do I want to do what I'll enjoy? Because I'll enjoy it. End of story. No further reason why I do what I enjoy. I mean, there might be. It might lower my blood pressure or something, but it doesn't have to be. Because when you have a chain of motivation and you get to something that you enjoy, that's a natural place for the chain of motivation to stop. You do it because you enjoy it. And someone who says, yeah, but I'm asking why, I want an explanation. This doesn't get further explanation. It doesn't need a further explanation. Similarly, and I want to make this point because people, I think, are overly narrow about this. You see me handing $500 to someone. And why are you giving him $500? I said, because I borrowed it. And so, why are you giving it to someone you borrowed it from? I said, because since I borrowed the money, I owe it, right? And I'm paying it back. Well, why are you paying back the money that you owe? Do you live on this planet? I borrow money, I pay it back. Because when I borrow it, an obligation to pay it back, and I do what I'm obligated to do. Well, why do you do what you're obligated to do? Because I'm obligated to do it. That may very well be the answer. There may not be any further answer. One simple way to see that this has to be right is because your brain is finite. And since your brain is finite, it can't hold an infinity of purposes. When you do A for B and B for C and C for D and D for E, there's got to be a stop somewhere because your brain can't hold more than a finite amount of information. Someplace it's got to be, I'm going after this, Q, because I'm going after it. That's all, not for the sake of anything else. There's a good example of why the why question presupposes that there are acceptable stopping points. And when it comes to a stopping point, you can't object, yeah, but I want to know why that also. That's an illegitimate demand. Now, as I said at the outset, not all stopping points are equally legitimate. If somebody said, why are you working the job? To earn money. Why earn money? To earn money. That's why. I think then we would say, look, lots and lots of people are working to earn money, and lots of them have lots and lots of reasons for earning money. It isn't as if people don't have reasons for earning money. They do, and they have lots of different ones. So, although it might be in your case that it stops with the money, but it might very well not be. And since it might very well not be, I'm questioning you to see whether there's some further motivations. It's relevant to ask, right? Especially if money for him is just $100 bills, which are rectangular pieces of paper, colored and stamped in certain ways. He just wants more of them. The more rectangular $100 bills, the better. At that point, we're going to question his sanity, because most people use money to buy things, right? And then you want to know what do you want to buy with it. I just want to have more and more of them. So it's possible, but there it's relevant to question. The question is pressing because we know many people do these sorts of things for very many different reasons. But when you get to the point where I'm doing it because I'll enjoy it, and you say, but why do you do things you enjoy? At that point, the question becomes weird, because we all know that very often the end point to our motivation is doing something that we enjoy. Or the end point of motivation is doing something that we feel we ought to do. Morality also is a stopping point in motivation. Again, it doesn't have to be. A person can do what he ought to do because it'll give him a good reputation. If he has a good reputation, he'll get more money at the bank. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It's quite reasonable to stop at, I'm doing it because because I'm obligated to do it, and that could be the end of the motivational chain. So the first point that I'm making about why questions is, you mustn't expect to be able to re-ask the question at every stage. Are we together so far? Okay, now this applies to the question that bothers a lot of people. Why did God create the universe? In particular, we're talking about motivation. The problem becomes, to be motivated to do something, if I do A in order to what? To get B? In order that B should happen? That means B is something I think is valuable, and I don't have it. It doesn't exist. So it means I'm acting so as to produce something that's not already in existence, that's not already in my possession. Now, if you think of the Creator as perfect, in the best possible condition, then he can't want something because he lacks it and needs it in order to put himself in a better position. Being perfect means there is no better position. So here it might seem that the question can't have an answer. And then we'd be faced with the idea that God does what he does for what in our terms would be no reason at all. And that would mean that we'd be disconnected from his form of action. His form of action wouldn't be like ours, and we'd have no understanding of it. That wouldn't be a disaster. I don't think we have to expect to understand the infinite creator of the universe. But if we could get an answer, it would be more understandable. And indeed, as part of the teaching of the Jewish tradition, that God revealed himself in a way that we would be able to understand. That is to say, he created a message about himself, and that message is a message we can understand. Is that message ultimately true, perfectly true? No. It's a message that we need to have about him so that we can operate in this world. When you will have children, let's say 6-year-olds, they'll ask you, when I push the button on the wall, why does the light go on? And you'll decide, shall I teach him about copper atoms with free electrons? And electron source, electron sink, and and the flow of quantum energy and so forth and so on. Probably not. 6 years old? Okay, he's Jewish. 4 years old. He probably won't teach him about that. You'll give him some rough model, the stuff going through the wire, and it makes the light go on, which isn't really true. Nothing's going through the wire. Pieces of the wire are moving. Nothing. It's not a hole. The wire is not a tube with electricity flowing through it. But you tell him what a 6-year-old can understand. Is that just nonsense, not gibberish? We didn't say leprechauns were doing it. No. There's something moving, and that's what makes the light. When I press the button, the stuff can move, and do the best you can. Because Baruch Hu gives us a set of information, and says, this is how you should think about me. Now, that set of information leaves open the possibility that there is something which he's creating the world for, which won't contradict his perfection. Which won't contradict his perfection. The way it works is like this. Ramchal says the Das Tunis, I'll just say it. One element of perfection is goodness. Something which wasn't good can be made better by being good. So if you're perfect, it can't be made any better. Then you have to have goodness. Now, goodness comes, you can distinguish two elements in goodness. One is potential goodness, the power of doing good, the capacity, the tendency or disposition to do good on the one hand, and the actual performance of good. So let's take someone who's very saintly. If you come from a secular tradition, maybe the name Albert Schweitzer will help you. If you come from our tradition, maybe Hillel. And imagine him isolated on a South Sea island. Totally isolated. And to keep Peter Singer happy, we'll say there are no animals there either. Because for him, animals are more important than human beings. No animals, right? If you're into trees, then there are no trees either. It's just these plankton off the surface of the ocean. At any rate, he may be a very good person. That is to say, he has very good moral character. That he has. But it doesn't follow. Thank you very much. But possessing the capacity to do good is inferior to actually doing the good. Capacity is only when the opportunity presents itself to actually produce something that's good. So for God to be perfect, it won't be enough that he has the capacity to do good. The capacity to do good will have to be realized. Now, doing good means presenting a benefit to something that needs the benefit. So God creates the world in order to realize his capacity of doing good by presenting a benefit to the creature that he creates. That's the reason for creating the world. So it's not incompatible with his being perfect. There is a picture in people's minds, intuitively, perfection means absolute passivity. If everything were perfect, I'd get in my hammock and sip my martini and watch old videotapes, and I would do nothing. I would just be totally passive. That's totally arbitrary. Indeed, one might think of perfection as continuous activity. Here, perfection includes goodness. The goodness has to be ideal. Ideal goodness is not just the capacity to do good, but the actuality of doing good. Doing good means presenting a benefit to some recipient. So you create a recipient in order to do good to that recipient. So here's a purpose for creating the world. Now, the person who's stuck on why questions says, yeah, but why does he want to do that? Why does he want to give good to a creature that he created that needs good? Why does he want to do that? And now, the introduction that I gave you becomes very important. Why do you expect that question must have an answer? Why are you pushing the question? Why do you imply by your tone of voice that if I don't get an answer to that, you haven't told me anything, it's worthless, I've got no understanding or whatsoever? Because that's coming from, when I get why A because B and why B because C, then I ask why C. I do that. And when I get C because D, then I want to know about D, and I don't stop. Well, if you don't stop, you're irrational. You're irrational because you're condemning yourself either to an infinite chain or to a circle, and neither of which gets you any answers. You have to recognize that there are stopping points. Not every proposed stopping point is equal, but you have to recognize that there is such a thing as a stopping point. You can't have a principle of always re-asking why. Asking the question why needs a justification. It needs a reason why you're asking why. Otherwise, it could be an empty question. Now here, I've already given the answer. The expression of goodness is because of his perfection. It's his perfection that demands the expression of goodness. Otherwise, it wouldn't be perfect. Yeah.
When some people are so stubborn, they already know the answer in their mind, how do you, not disprove, but sort of tell them, look, you're not the only one with this opinion. There are other people, but like they think that they're correct and they're not gonna budge. They just have.
I'm not sure how that's related to what we said so far.
Because
You
we're
did
saying-
you did come in late, so you didn't really. I think you know exactly what subject it is. But we're not talking about winning debates now. We're not talking about educating people now. We're talking about why questions in general, in particular the question of why God created the universe. And all I'm doing now is saying there are people who, whenever they ask why, get an answer, ask the why question again about the answer. And that commitment to always re-ask the question is not reasonable. Not reasonable because if you have that commitment, then you are committed to the why questions going in an infinite chain or going around in a circle, which means you don't get any answer at all. To ask a why question in such a way that it's permissible to get, that it's possible to get an answer, you have to recognize that sometimes you'll say why P because Q and why Q. That's the way it is. That's just the way it is. If you don't allow that, then you're not a serious player in the question game. You're just you're into it in a way that you've predetermined that it can have no successful outcome. Right? You know, it's sort of like with elementary particles, right? You boil everything down to elementary particles. Things do what they do because they're combinations of particles, and the particles have their features, right? So you take two electrons, push them together. The closer they get together, the harder it is to push them together, because they repel one another. You see. Why do they do that? Well, that's the universe we live in. If you explain why things do what they do on the basis of their parts and structure, according to contemporary science, electrons have no parts and no structure. They have no parts, they have no structure. Then there's no further explanation as to why they do it. That's what they do. Someone says, yeah, but you didn't tell me why. Right, I didn't. But then you haven't given me any reason to think that I should tell you why. You give me no reason why I should expect there will be a why. A why is it's like fishing. Maybe yes, maybe no. There's no commitment beforehand. It's got to work out one way or the other. When you get down to elementary particles, there's certainly the possibility that that's the end of explanations. There are no further explanations. What are called brute facts. There's no guarantee we don't live in a universe with brute facts. Rav Moshe, I'm giving you a shir. Can I call you back?
No, okay, whenever it's convenient. Bye.
Bye. Yeah. So that's the reason why God created. You had a question?
Yeah, is there a way to explain the nuance between the questions of how and why? Because asking why do these particles repel is a different question from saying how, but it seems like the person wants to know the same thing, right?
I'll tell you, I'm following now a philosopher named John Searle who gives this general framework for why questions, ask for explanations. Now, how is also a certain type of explanation. So it works like this, you know, why did that glass of water explode? And somebody says, because I put in some pure sulfur. Oh, okay, I'll be careful not to do that in the future. I see that has disastrous consequences. But why does putting sulfur in water cause the water to explode? That's really a how question. How is it that the sulfur and the water interact so as to produce the explosion? So the word why can cover that as well. It's using it as a very general, elastic term as a request for explanation. Okay, so how is just like a subclass of why.
So perhaps like when people ask why questions about God, it seems like really they're including a how in that, but the how is unknowable. Like we can't know how God like created the whole system that we have, and every minute detail of how everything came to be. But rather, like we have a more general overview of what He revealed to us.
No, I don't think that's right. You ask why questions about things that happen, and you can be very satisfied. Again, why did I'm in a chemistry laboratory, and there's lots and lots of things in labeled jars all over, right? And I saw him throw something into the glass of water and explode it, and I said, why did that happen? Because I want to know which thing in which jar not to throw into the water. That's what I want to know. He says, oh, it's in the sulfur jar. He gave me some very good information. I don't need to know the chemical structure of sulfur and how it interacts with the H2O to produce the explosion. I know which one produces the explosion, and now I know how to avoid it. So it isn't as if the how is included, and if I don't get the how, I haven't got anything. It didn't really answer me. It's just a mistake. No, he gave me really true, valuable information. Further information? Yeah, there are further questions to ask, no question. But isn't that the how is included in the why?
So like why provokes like a search for meaning, right? The person wants to know like the meaning behind something.
I wouldn't use the word meaning. Meaning is too vague. I would look for a cause. Cause is much easier than meaning. Meaning sounds subjective, and usually it's not looking for something subjective, looking for something that's real about the world. Okay? So now, when I'm talking now in the second chapter of the Derech Hashem by Baron Chal, when the project is to give good, so then the question will be, well, what good is that? What is this good? And what kind of good will the infinitely good Creator give? And Chal's answer is that he's not going to be satisfied with a halfway good, partial good, a substandard good. He's going to present the greatest good. Now, at that point, the Ramchal says, well, what is the greatest good? God himself is the greatest good. So, if he's going to give the greatest good to the creature that he creates, what he should give is himself. That is to say, he should give his being to that creature, which means he should create something that's equal to himself. That's how the logic goes so far. But now you face an immediate contradiction, because one of the perfections of the Creator is that he's totally self-sufficient, totally self-defined, totally independent. By definition, a creature, something that's created, can't be totally self-sufficient, totally self-contained, totally self-defined, totally independent. Can't be that because it's created by something else. So this description of the project is wrong. Now, the description of the project is wrong because it's got a contradiction in it. And for those who find that maybe contradiction should be tolerated, because this is, after all, talking about an infinite God, I'll just take a few moments to describe to you why we shouldn't tolerate contradictions. If it's difficult, I don't mind spending time on this because this is a precondition for understanding anything. What's wrong with contradictions is that they don't make sense. We are talking. We're talking to each other. We're trying to describe something. In order for us to communicate, in order for us to have any subject under discussion, our words have to make sense. Otherwise, we could just say gobbledygook and go home. If I give you a description and you point out, hey, over there you said it's 2, and over there you said 3, can't be both 2 and 3, and I say, yeah, but so what? We're talking about God, so it doesn't matter. What I'm really saying is, I don't care whether you understand me or not. I don't care whether it makes sense or not. I don't care whether I said anything or not. We're just, creating airwaves. We're just wasting time. In order for us to discuss any subject, we have to agree that we're trying to make sense. If I say that God is a square circle, the right response to that is, what? Square circle? What? I don't get you. You might just as well say God is blah. Square circle? Sorry. Not buying that. Not buying it. That's not true. You didn't say anything. You're using words in a way that we don't understand. So if the description that I'm trying to give of what God's purpose is, or how he runs the world, or what his preferences are, ends up in the contradiction, I've failed to make sense. If I fail to make sense, it's the end of the project. So we're not going to tolerate on the grounds that, well, God doesn't have to obey the laws of logic. No, he doesn't have to obey any laws. We do. If we don't obey the laws of logic, we don't talk sense. If we don't talk sense, we can just stop talking. That's fine. Someone says our talk is incompetent, and therefore we don't talk, we just feel, that's consistent. That's fine. But to talk and talk and talk, and then end up with a contradiction, say, don't worry about the contradiction because we're talking about God, that's an incompetent project. The project was to talk and describe and make sense. That was the project. If you fail the project, then say honestly that you failed and go drive a bus or something. Leave everybody else alone. Okay, so now, if the project is to give good, and he is the greatest good, and he therefore should be, on one hand, giving good to a creature, but his good means not being a creature. You can't give not being a creature to a creature. That's a contradiction. So Ramchal says, what he does is he gives the greatest good that a creature could have. Of course, it's limited. He's going to create him. But then there are various grades of good that creatures could have. And the greatest good will be the greatest good that a creature can possess. Now, what good is that? Well, if God is the greatest good, it means to be as similar to God as a creature can be, given the limitations of being a creature. As similar is one thing that he says, and also to be put in a position where he can be benefited by God's infinite goodness, which he can't possess. Part he can possess, and the other part he can benefit from by a certain relationship, even without possessing it. That's the goal for the human being, to make the human being as godlike as possible, and also that should put him in a position where he can benefit from the rest of God's infinity, which he can't possess on his own. Now, what the Ramchal has done here is something I think very remarkable. He's taken a verse in Genesis, which everybody knows, that God created man in God's own form, not image, that's a mistake, God's own form. That's an axiom of the Jewish religion. And he asked, but why is that? Why did he do it that way? Or to be brutal, why wasn't he satisfied with horses? Why are human beings special? And the answer is that human beings can be as godlike as a creature can be. That's what distinguishes human beings from everything else. They can have more godlikeness and more connection to God than any other creature. And if you ask, why does he want something which is godlike? The answer is because in that way he does the maximum good. That's the way of giving the maximum good. And that's the way he realizes his goodness, which should not just be potential, but should be actual, by giving the maximum good. That's the program of why God created the universe. Questions up to here? Yeah.
Quickly, some rabbis say that when you're learning Torah, it's like learning the software, like the programming behind like God. Would you say that's like?
It's a complicated mushal. I taught computer science, among other things, because you have the software and the hardware, and the same software is realizable in different types of hardware, and then that creates different performances and so on and so on. But there is a certain sense of structure. It's a little bit like an engineer. You know what reverse engineering is? Yeah. You have a product, and then you try to figure out how it was built, because you see what it is, and then figure out what all the gadgets in it do. Sometimes that's hard to figure out. Why it's this way rather than that way, And it always points north. I wonder why it does that. Cows, when they herd, pointed on the north-south line. They have bacteria which sense the magnetic field of the earth, and they line up, right? So somebody figured out a good reason for them to line up. If you're attacked by wolves, right? If you're in a herd and everyone's going to run in a different direction, they're going to crash into each other. That's not too efficient in escaping the wolves. But if you're in a line and everybody bolts from the line, they won't crash into each other. So that's a pretty good reason to have and line up, right? So, you look for structure, underlying principles that lead to the outcome, and then if I've got these three principles working together, if I take this one out, then it's going to go this way. And I take this one out, it's going to go that way. If I replace this one with that, then it's going to go that way, because you've got a structure and you can predict what the results will be. Lumdus is like this all the time. Lumdus Gemara is finding the structure behind the halacha, and then you can predict that if I change this part, then the outcome will be different. You get a tremendous amount of information when you do that. That's what you want to do. You want to do the engineering behind the halachos. Okay, now let's just take a few elements in this project. One aspect of God is that he is independent. totally and necessarily independent. Everything that he is because of himself and only because of himself. Could a creature also be independent? Well, let's see. Independent? Totally and necessarily independent? For sure not, because it is a creature. And it's created. And since it's created, it can't be totally independent. Could it be partly independent? Contingently independent? Maybe yes, maybe no. But is it possible for a creature to have any independence at all? And the answer is yes, because the creature may have free will. Free will means freedom from external causation. When a person makes a free decision, the outcome is because of the decision that he made, not because of something that God did. So everything about a squirrel is the way God created it. Almost everything about an angel is because of the way God created it. Much of a human being is not because God created it that way. He created it with the capacity to be self-creative. He created it with the capacity to make his own decisions. And then this human being becomes a source for that outcome, and therefore it's due to him. Similarly to the way in which what God is due to him, only there are strong differences of quantity. His is necessary and mine is contingent. His is total and mine is partial. But still, if you looked at the whole and looked for independence, you'd find it in spades in God, and you'd find it in sand in human beings. But independent applies to both. So there is that commonality. Now, if God's being is the ultimate good, then having at least some independence is a good. Now, that's a good that God gives. And by the way, well, I've said this to those who are learning the Torah Hashem, but this I didn't say. And this I think is worth mentioning here. Does God have free will?
No.
Does God have free will? Well, it depends on what you mean by free. I just gave you a definition of free a moment ago. Don't expect you to remember everything because we do a lot in here. I said free means free from external causation. Free from external causation. Nothing outside makes it happen. Does God have free will?
Yes.
For sure. Nothing outside God makes God do anything. He has free will in spades. He's got ideal free will. Total ideal free will. Is completely free of any external causation. But then someone says, yeah, but look, with human free will, there's good and evil. You have a good inclination and evil inclination, and they're in conflict with one another. You have conflicting motivations, and you decide between them the possibility of doing evil. Do we really want to say that God is like that? God has conflicting motivations, and God has the possibility of doing evil and makes free choices between them. So, does he really have free will? Doesn't he really have free will? Here the answer is you got to distinguish between the fact of free will on the one hand and how you engineer free will in certain circumstances where you overcome obstacles. The engineering project isn't the definition of free will, it's how you accomplish it when you're facing certain obstacles. Free will means free of external causation, period. Does God have free will? For sure. But now when you come to a creature, something that's created, which means that there's an external causation that's affecting it very powerfully. It's giving it its existence, its nature, its conditions. The question becomes, is there any space for freedom in such a creature? Here the problem is engineering. When you have a creature which is, so to speak, overwhelmed by divine causation, it can't be avoided. Is there any room for it to be self-determined? Here you've got to program free will into the creature. And here the way of doing it is to say that certain things that happen in the creature aren't directly caused by God, and the creature has an internal mechanism of its own which gives the outcome of what it does, and that internal mechanism could operate in one of two different ways, because if it could only operate in one way, and God created it that way, then God would be causing the outcome, and it wouldn't be free of divine causation. So you create alternatives, you create conflict, you create the power to select one of the alternatives, All of that is how you engineer the free will in the human case, not the definition of free will. Freedom means freedom from external causation. God has it without all that engineering. In human beings' case, you have to have the engineering, otherwise you won't have it. So when I say that God doesn't have the possibility of doing evil, that doesn't mean his will isn't free. It's free of all external causation. That's all that freedom has to mean. Okay, so that's the first step. In this way God creates us, there's a similarity between us and God, which is basic to his nature and basic to the importance of our nature and our accomplishment. Then the resemblance carries moral and spiritual qualities like kindness, like justice, like mercy, like truth, like consistency, like relating to that which is greater than myself with the appropriate submission and subservience to the thing which is greater than myself. What's sometimes called an ava. And other qualities like that. And then you need the elementary observation that those qualities, moral and spiritual qualities, are only possessed by creatures that have free will. Otherwise, there's no moral or spiritual quality to what anything does. Let's imagine that squirrels gather acorns for the winter, and some are stronger, some are weaker, some have more energy, less energy, put it into a giant store of acorns, and over the winter, they all share it out equally. Look at that. Kindness, consideration for the poor and the weak, and so forth and so on. Justice, equity, all that kind of stuff. No, it's just a machine, that's all. They're just complicated machines. They have no free will. So they don't get any moral credit. And it's very funny because the people who talk about these things want to talk about sort of the beginnings of moral values in animals, like certain chimpanzees and others, although some of the work is phony. One of the Jewish researchers at Harvard had to retire because he cheated on his results. You can see where they're coming from. But somehow, discovering, sharing, or respecting and so forth and so on, and that being the beginnings of human morality, isn't matched by saying that lions are vicious criminals because they chase wild gazelles and they tear them apart when they're alive and eat them. So that's criminality, destruction, death, murder. That's the beginnings of human evil? Not really. That some of that doesn't count. Only the good side counts, the bad side doesn't count. Doesn't sound like objective research to me. Mm-hmm. And even angels, who, if you know, do exercise some free will. The angels that came to Sodom when they told Lot he's got to leave. And they said, because we are destroying this place. Later, when they come to the end of the evening's activities and they want him to leave, and one says, I can't do anything until you leave. So Chazal comment, you started by saying we are destroying, and now you say you can't do anything, because when you said we are destroying, you spoke inappropriately. You're not destroying the place. You're nothing. You're a shliach. Malach in Hebrew means shliach. Shliach does not mean messenger. It means agent. You're acting on behalf of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's his power. Malach comes from malacha. Right? It doesn't have to carry messages. It's just a mistaken translation. So, they're being punished by being forced to say, I can't do anything, to admit that you can't do anything. Okay, but the way malachim are described is that if they're given an order, they can't disobey. Other things involved in carrying out the order, they can make their own decisions, they can make them better or worse, but they cannot disobey. So the level of their free will is trivial. It's there, but it's trivial. A human being has the power to say no. There's the ability to disobey. There's the ability to be evil straight out, not just to make mistakes, but to be evil straight out. The human choices are between good and evil, and that's the choice that makes the human being able to develop moral capacities. You can choose to share or to hoard. You can choose to pay appropriately or to cheat. You can choose to speak the truth or to speak something that's not true. Straight out and out, obedience and disobedience. That makes his choices crucial, that they have large consequences. And when he makes them right, he becomes self-creating. The famous pasuk, Ela told us Noach ish tzadik tamei b'zarasav es Elokim salech Noach. There's a lot of commentary on that verse. These are the products, according to Rashi, of Noach. This is what he accomplished. Noach was righteous and pure man in his generations. He walked with God. Those are all moral descriptions. And what the commentators point out is that your moral accomplishments are your products. You make yourself into that kind of person. You perform those actions in terms of your free will, and in that way, they define your moral character. But I didn't see the commentators, but there are hundreds of commentators. But I didn't see the commentators comment. It says Ela told us Noach. Noach repeats his name. You knew that in English. These are the products of Noach. He did this, this, and this, and this. You wouldn't repeat the name. According to what we just said, based on the Chazal, the message is this. These are the products of Noach himself. He produced himself. Because the Kadosh Baruch Hu creates a human being with a big empty space and says, you fill it in. You fill it in. I gave you free will. With your free will choices, you not only affect the world around you, but you also affect yourself. You build yourself. So that in the end of the day, what you are is very greatly a matter of your own creativity. That's the way in which you become very much like God. Now, Rabbi Yonah wrote Shari Tshuva, but he also wrote an Igeris of Musar, of Moshe Shapiro, and gave a hesped here for Rav Mendel Weinbach, who was one of the founders of Ohr Somayach. And he quoted a piece of that which nobody knew. I had to look it up afterwards. And it says, like it says, Mahu Rachum Avatar Rachum, just as he is merciful, you should be merciful. Mahu Chanu Avatar Chanu, just as he's gracious, you should be gracious. Right? Mahu Borei Olamos, Avatar Borei Olamos, just as he creates worlds, so you too should create worlds. That's what Rabbi Yonah says. It's not in the Chazal, but that's what he says. Okay? You understand that, among other things, you create your own world. You create your own character. You create your own moral and spiritual essence. That's what you create. You made that. It wasn't given to you by God. He gave you capacities, and you realized those capacities. That's Borei Olamos. Just like we say, someone who saves a Jewish life, as if he saved the whole world. You are a whole world. If you create yourself, you're creating a whole world. So here's another similarity that we can have with God. That we can make out of ourselves, and the way similar to the way he makes the world. So this is the name of the project. The name of the project is that we should be as godlike as possible, not as an end unto itself. This is, again, the genius of the Ramchal, to take basic ideas of the Torah and to go behind them, to find Torah principles which are more fundamental, more basic, and see these principles, these verses, as an expression of these underlying more basic ideas. Ramchal was really a philosopher. He was a great Kabbalist, one of the greatest Kabbalists of all time, but his intellectual character is that of a philosopher. He asks questions that nobody else asks, and he gives structure to what other people just take for granted. Questions up to here? Yeah, it's 8:25 already. Okay? Be careful with why questions.